When an avoidant realizes you have given up, the 7 stages of internal collapse. There is a moment, quiet, unannounced, and invisible to the outside world, when an avoidant finally realizes you have given up. And it doesn't happen when you block them, or confront them, or demand closure. It happens when the emotional tether they relied on, without admitting it, simply goes still. And at first, they don't panic because avoidants are trained by their nervous system to equate distance with safety. So when your energy disappears, their mind tells them this is relief, this is peace, this is what they wanted all along. Yet underneath that calm is the first crack, because something feels off in a way they can't name. A subtle loss of stimulation, a silence that isn't soothing but hollow, and they begin stage 1 of their internal collapse, mislabeling the loss as freedom, convincing themselves that life is easier now, that they can breathe, that they no longer have to manage expectations or emotional responsibility. But this sense of freedom is strangely empty because what they lost wasn't pressure, it was regulation. And they don't realize yet that your presence was helping stabilize emotions they never learned to self-soothe. As days or weeks pass, the second stage begins to unfold. And this is where confusion replaces relief, because the avoidant starts noticing the absence in unexpected moments. When something stressful happens and there's no one checking in, when something good happens and there's no one to share it with, when their phone stays silent in ways it never did before, and they find themselves oddly unsettled by the lack of pursuit, because your consistency had become a background signal of worth. A quiet reassurance that someone was still emotionally available even when they were distant. And now that signal is gone, forcing them to confront an unfamiliar sensation. Emotional freefall, where there is no one chasing, no one anchoring, no one compensating for their emotional absence, and the confusion deepens because their old coping strategies, distraction, work, busyness, emotional detachment, don't fully numb the discomfort this time. Stage 3 is where the internal collapse becomes personal because the avoidant begins to feel something they rarely tolerate for long: self-focused awareness. And this is dangerous territory for an avoidant because it brings them face to face with the possibility that you didn't disappear because you were weak, needy, or unstable, but because you reached clarity. And that realization quietly threatens the story they've always told themselves: that they are independent, that others are too demanding, that relationships fail because people want too much. And now that narrative starts to wobble, replaced by an uncomfortable question they can't quite shake. What if I wasn't as unaffected as I thought? And this is the stage where regret doesn't scream yet, but whispers, where memories surface uninvited. Not the dramatic fights, but the moments of warmth, safety, laughter, and emotional access they never acknowledged while it was happening. Then comes stage 4, the most destabilizing phase, where loss finally registers in the body, not just the mind. And this is when the avoidant feels anxiety without a clear target, restlessness without direction, irritation that seems to come from nowhere, because their nervous system has lost a familiar emotional rhythm. And unlike anxious partners who externalize distress, avoidants internalize it, often misinterpreting emotional pain as boredom, dissatisfaction, or a desire for something new, which is why they might suddenly think about reaching out, not with vulnerability, but with curiosity, a casual message, a neutral check-in, because part of them wants to test whether the door is still open. And when they sense that it isn't, that your energy has truly shifted, panic quietly sets in, not the dramatic kind, but a cold, sinking realization that they no longer control the distance. Stage 5 is where the collapse becomes ego-threatening, because the avoidant begins to feel replaced, not necessarily by another person, but by your peace, your growth, your emotional withdrawal. And this is devastating to an attachment style that relies on being wanted without having to fully engage, because your detachment reflects something they fear deeply: that they were not essential, that their presence was optional, that you were capable of choosing yourself over the cycle. And this triggers a mix of longing and defensiveness, where they oscillate between missing you and minimizing you, telling themselves you weren't right for them while still replaying your emotional presence in their mind. And this internal tug of war drains them more than any relationship ever did. In stage 6, introspection finally breaks through the avoidance, not in a clean or healthy way, but in fragments, where they begin connecting dots they spent years disconnecting, noticing patterns across past relationships, recognizing how often people pulled away after giving more than they received, and for the first time, they feel the weight of emotional consequences they once avoided by staying detached. And this is where the internal collapse either becomes a turning point or a defense mechanism, because some avoidants will double down on detachment, convincing themselves they are better off alone, while others feel something shift, an aching awareness that their protective walls didn't just keep pain out, they kept intimacy out too. And now that the person who once tolerated that distance has left, the walls feel less like safety and more like isolation. The final stage is acceptance, but not the peaceful kind people imagine. It's a quiet, heavy resignation where the avoidant realizes that you are not coming back the same, if at all, and that whatever bond existed has fundamentally changed. And this realization forces them to sit with something they've avoided their entire lives, grief without escape, because they can no longer rewrite the story in real time, no longer control the emotional dynamic, no longer rely on your patience as a safety net. And whether they grow from this or repeat the cycle elsewhere depends on whether they choose awareness over avoidance. But one truth remains constant. When an avoidant realizes you have truly given up, the collapse doesn't happen loudly or immediately. It happens slowly, internally, and irrevocably. Because losing someone who once stayed, despite emotional distance, is not just a breakup. It's the loss of a mirror that reflected their unhealed patterns back to them. And once that mirror is gone, they are left alone with themselves. At the end, what matters most is not whether the avoidant understands what they lost, but whether you understand what you survived. Because the moment you stopped chasing was the moment you reclaimed your power, your clarity, and your emotional dignity. Their internal collapse may continue quietly, unseen and unresolved, but your healing no longer depends on their awareness or remorse. You don't need closure from someone who could only love you at a distance, and you don't need validation from someone who couldn't meet you where you stood. Walking away wasn't a failure of patience or compassion. It was an act of self-respect, a decision to stop abandoning yourself in the hope that someone else would finally show up. And as you move forward, remember this: the right connection will never require you to disappear in order to be valued or to suffer in silence to keep someone comfortable. When you choose peace over pursuit, growth over waiting, and self-trust over hope, you don't just end a cycle, you begin a new chapter, one where love feels steady, mutual, and safe, and where you are no longer asking to be chosen because you have already